Good morning, and thank you, Amy Steinberg. Amy writes a lot of wonderful music, and it's full of energy, and that song especially, I think, is really helpful as we find ourselves 8+ months into this coronavirus experience. And as many of you already know, because you're not here, you're home watching us, that we're in the purple tier. So I'm really glad that you could join us by means of technology, so welcome. I do want to share with you just a couple of resources that were in our e-news. I want to make sure you take advantage of them. On Thanksgiving Eve, our sister center in North Jersey is hosting Karen Drucker, and she'll be doing a Thanksgiving Eve service. Check it out in the e-news. And then on Thanksgiving Day, our very own Reverend Elijah and Callie Ratner will be hosting a wonderful special Project to Connect at 1 o'clock. So those are two ways that you can continue to stay connected with each other, even when we're asked to stay home. My talk today is God does not have a plan for you. That's quite a statement, is it not? I remember the first time someone said that to me, and it went through me like a shot, because I'd always kind of hoped that there was something larger than me that had a plan for everything. It was kind of how I was indoctrinated in the culture that we live in, that there's always someone or something, somebody who's got some, divine action, some divine plan out there for us. And so, I think back to the dark ages, before the internet, when many of us relied on the authorities and news programs and our local governments to tell us what was going on in the world. And it sure seemed like somebody had a plan. It sure seemed like somebody was in charge. And yet, fast forward to 2020, and everybody and their sister has a plan for you. If you would just listen to them, then you would know what to do. What I think about now is that when I say to you that God does not have a plan for you, there's a little bit of subtext to that, and that it's more like a system than a plan. It's more like a way of being, a way of living than a plan for you. And it puts you in control. It puts you in the driver's seat. And I like to think of this plan, I like to refer to it as the creative process. That God is always creating out of itself through us. That God is always creating this perfect, whole, and complete presencing that moves through us and out into the world. Holmes had a kind of a fancy word for it. If you have a Science of Mind textbook, it's described in the glossary. He called it deductive reasoning. And what he meant was that at the highest level of creation, there's only truth. And that truth just always knows itself and is always creating out of itself in that perfected truth and wholeness and completeness. It doesn't have to think about what it wants to create. It doesn't have to dream up schemas and strategies for life. It just expresses wholeness. And then we get in the picture, right? And then we come into it and we begin to impose that pure download of wholeness that's moving through humanity. We begin to insert our beliefs and our thoughts on that pure download. And then that's what we experience. Our Reverend Elijah talks about it in really simplistic terms, really straightforward terms actually. He calls it a feedback loop. That we are just in this feedback loop where our thoughts create our realities, which inform our thoughts, which then informs our reality, which then reinforces our thoughts and beliefs, which then creates our experience, which then deepens our thoughts and our beliefs. And so the question that you have to ask yourself is, how do you like the story you're living out? Is it working for you? Now, some of you may be like, all good here. But if you're like me, if you're paying attention to what's going on out in the universe, you might be noticing that there's quite a lot of shift going on right now. You might be noticing that there's a lot of disturbance and disruption. And dare I say that the people that I'm talking to, I'm not finding a lot of people who are sort of kicking back and saying it's all good here. There's a lot of people who are deeply concerned about what's going on right now in our world. And I think there's a lot of people who are upset that there's not a plan. They're wanting to villainize the people who aren't engaged in the plan they think is supposed to be unfolding. You don't have to look too far to see disruption or discordance or challenges out in the world. We've got politics, racism, public health issues, economic issues. And I bet that you think that the reality you are currently experiencing is a result of one of those things that is going on in our planet. But what if I told you that what you are experiencing is really the collective thoughts and ideas and beliefs that we hold as a humanity that is out into our world, and that reality comes second, not first. Now, if you've been hanging out with us at Centers for Spiritual Living for any amount of time, you've probably heard something similar to this before. But I think it bears repeating because the distractions and the disruptions and the upheaval continues to happen, and it continues to grab our attention. As I was thinking about this week and what we were going to talk about, excuse me, I pulled a classic off of my bookshelf. Maybe some of you have heard it. It's called The Crack in the Cosmic Age. The Crack in the Cosmic Egg by Joseph Pearce. And Pearce describes our culture as this cosmic egg that needs its logic in order to create some kind of protection around us. And so our mind is always leaning towards trying to order reality so that we can function and can exist in it and feel comfortable in it. And yet, as I understand his theory, what happens is that fragile shell, that cosmic egg, if you will, begins to crack as it's time for us to expand and evolve and grow. We get too attached to the protective shell, though, and we can't quite see past it because it's been protecting us, and there's a lot going on that feels uncertain, and it brings up fear in us. So Pearce talks about it this way, and I quote, he says that we live in a second-hand reality. What we believe about the world, we project onto the world. Our world is in our own heads much more than it is out there. What is actually out there is something which we are seldom in contact with except in what are termed altered states of consciousness. What we believe has a formative effect on our perceived reality. And so what he's talking about when he's talking, now this book was written 1971. We're talking like 50 years. And when so in 50 years ago in 1971, what he was talking about in these altered states of reality and consciousness, he's really talking about what we know as the consciousness work that has really become fully developed over the last 20 or 30, 40 years. I'm losing track of time. It seems like it's been here for a long time. And so these altered states of consciousness are really those places that we begin to develop so that we can be on the leading edge of what we create, as opposed to the trailing edge. As a society, however, we tend to really fight to hold on to our stories, don't we? And those stories are many and varied, and they're personal and they're global. Even this community has a story. We've been a community for 56 years. And for 56 years, as I have gotten to know us, I've been here for a little over 3, and as I've gotten to know the community, as I've gotten to really get a sense of who we are, what I notice is there seems to be this underlying subtle story about how we champion adversity, how we always have just enough to get by, as the community and the volunteers do this heroic effort for whatever the adversity is to be able to transcend it and to make it through, and that we're stronger as a community on the other side. And while this story is a beautiful story, it's a story of strength and it's a story of commitment, it also includes that need to have something that brings us together, some kind of adversity that is going to help us to continue to thread that quilt of strength around our community. And over the last year or so, we've been looking at building a new story. We've been looking at how we can create this new story that is built on already being healthy, already being resourced, that these adversities aren't major upheavals, they're just stuff we work through. And that we don't have to be saved by our heroic volunteers, but that we support and thrive because we belong to each other and because we subscribe to a way of life and because we choose to be that place where we use that creative process to create something that is whole and perfect and complete and demonstrates his wholeness. I certainly have had my own stories that I've had to overcome many years ago when I walked through my divorce. That story has two titles. The story when my divorce first happened was he left me, and it was full of betrayal and abandonment and rejection. But I have been a student of this philosophy and this way of life long enough to know that it was the suffering that came up was the opportunity for me to actually walk out a new story, to let go of the old story so that I could begin to move through the pain and the discomfort of what I was experiencing so that I could come out to the other side. And so the title of my story now is that I am free. It's a very different title than the story that I started out with when I first started moving through my divorce. And it required that I open up and I allow myself to begin to see the threads of limited thinking and old thought forms that weren't serving me. And it wasn't enough for me to simply say, oh, that's not real, I'm just going to have this higher thought. I had to walk it out. I had to walk out the suffering. And so what I see happening in our world right now is that there's a lot of suffering and pain and holding on to stories that are very meaningful and important to each and every one of us. But in order for us to transcend, to allow that cosmic egg to crack so that we can evolve as a humanity and as a society and as a culture, we need to walk the suffering out. Not to swim in it, but to heal it. And the truth is, we're not ever really healing anything. We're just revealing the greater wholeness. Remember that system that I told you about, that God doesn't have a plan, but it has this system that we can work with that's going to allow us to be able to see what it is that's before us that is not representative of that pure energy of wholeness that wants to move through us and create the world around us. We can recognize those things that we lay on top of that and begin to peel them away so that we can have that greater experience of wholeness, so we can have that greater experience of completeness. And 2020, yeah, it's a term now, isn't it? Right? When you say 2020, it means something more than just the year we're in. It has its own meaning attached to it because of everything that's happened this year. And so 2020 is this amazing global experience that we're having to allow that cosmic egg, that protective shell that we've created with our need for order, to break open so that we can begin to have the experiences that we know are possible. Our book of the month is a book by Pema Chodron, and the title is Start Where You Are, A Guide to Compassionate Living. And she offers insight in that book about having the courage to acknowledge and identify our suffering and then face it with compassion. And that it is the compassion, self-compassion, and then once we can begin to learn how to have compassion for ourselves, we can then extend that to others. And it is the compassion that's going to lead us through this breaking open that we are experiencing this year. It is going to require, if you're like me, when you look around and you see the loggerheads and you see the divisiveness and you see the folks that are just holding on with like vice-like grip to their stories, what I know is that I can't find compassion when I am that closed down, when I am holding on that tightly. Compassion isn't even in my vocabulary. And that the things that are going to move us forward really do need to ride on that powerful energy of compassion. And what Pema talks about in her book is how to take ourselves lightly, how to begin to not take ourselves so seriously. Now, I want to be clear that there's a lot going on in our world and that it is important, that the shift that's happening around racism and hopefully politics and the economy and the way we are used to relating to each other in this world, that is all shifting right now. And it's important, and I'm not suggesting that we just brush it off and say it's all good here. But I am suggesting that we hold ourselves a little less seriously and that we begin to cultivate this place of self-compassion and compassion for others so that we can begin to find that common ground. And the common ground isn't the story, the old story. The common ground is the new story that wants to be created right now. And so it is the compassion and this thing called the creative process that is going to allow us to begin to bridge from where we are right now to where we're going. What I know is that as this community continues to grow, as we continue to be part of the larger community, as we continue to support each other, as we move through our own evolution as a community, beautiful things are happening here as a result of something that was not desired, wanted, or invited. And so what I know is that we've grown our reach through technology. We've begun to reach so many more people thanks to YouTube and Facebook and the tech team here that puts together the sort of the back engine of our Sunday gathering. We're able to teach classes digitally so that people from all over the country can join our classes. I had people from the East Coast take my last class. I know that as we are continuing to grow in the last couple of years, we've brought on 2 ministers, Reverend Tamara Merrill and Reverend Elijah Christopher. And so our pool of teaching and wisdom is continuing to grow. Allow me to do this formal announcement to say that Reverend Elijah has agreed to accept the position as assistant minister. Not only that, he brings a fully orbed curriculum that he's teaching our community. So there's a lot of evolvement that is happening right now. And so as we move through this time, I mean, it's late November, we're about to start Thanksgiving. As we move through this time, this is a time for surrendering, for letting go, and for making room for the new. And that doesn't happen if we kick back thinking God has a plan. It happens when we accept the responsibility and the actual honor of being the authors of a new story. And what I know in this community is that we author that story in a collaborative fashion. And so what I also know is that you are all invited to be co-collaborators in what we are creating here as Centers for Spiritual Living Santa Cruz and what it is we're putting out into the world. So when you think about this idea that God does not have a plan, I want to remind you, or perhaps share with you, this quote from Charles Darwin, that it is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. The one most responsive to change. And our philosophy is a philosophy that allows us to really roll with the change and to be more directive and to be more responsive. And as we say every week in our centering statement, to respond to life with love and allow that love to direct us and to engage us and to be an accelerant for what's in our hearts and what's in our minds as we work together to create this beautiful vision of a world that works for everyone. Now is the time for change, and we are the ones to facilitate that change. It's time for us to pray, but before we pray, I want to just give you a heads up about what's coming up after the talk. We asked you for pictures of your family and the community, and so after the talk, we're going to enjoy a beautiful video by Leah, a Thanksgiving tribute to our wonderful, resilient community. So let's pray, and then we'll just let the prayer move right into that beautiful video and take us away. So, taking a deep breath, centering myself in my heart, knowing that there is indeed this power and this presence that is always in movement. It is the creative process. It is that thing that is moving in as and through all life. And so I presence myself with it right now. And I know that as we move through this Thanksgiving week, that we hold ourselves in deep gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to shift gears. That gratitude for the opportunity to love more. Gratitude for the opportunity to cultivate compassion in our relationships and in the way that we are in the world. I know that all of this is indeed the magic recipe for deep and abiding change. Change that will allow us to crack that protective layer that we have created around ourselves so that we can indeed have a more grounded experience with Spirit, so that we can be on the ground seeing Spirit work through us, as us, and by us. And so I claim this week that each one finds the perfect way to feel connected during Thanksgiving, finds the ideal place within their own body temple, within their own heart, to hold gratitude, to see the blessings in what may seem like very unlovely circumstances. So I trust that each one is empowered by that pure energy of Spirit. As we walk through this Thanksgiving week, I know that there is much to be grateful for. And so I simply anchor this prayer in that power and that presence, knowing that there is good and we ought to have it, and it is ours to behold. And so it is.